Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. Welcome to the Japan Zoominar. It is May 16 in San Diego at 4 p.m. and May 17th early in the morning where I am today with my guest Asa, who I will introduce shortly. I'm Ulrike Schaede, professor of Japanese business at UC San Diego and the director of jfit, the Japan Forum for Innovation and Technology. This event is held at the School of Global Policy and Strategy, GPS. We are an international relations and public policy school, and we have several degrees, including a Japan track degree. So if you're interested in that, please look us up at gps.ucsd.edu. And JFIT is our Japan Center, and more information on us is at jfit.ucsd.edu. And if you go there, you see something like this. And there are a number of tabs at the top. And one is called Japan Zoominars, which is where you can sign up for upcoming events and watch past events. That's right. Today's event is recorded and will later be at that tab. What this means is that not only can you go back and watch old ones, but today you're invited to type any questions you may have into the Q&A box. If I read out your question, I will refer to you only by your first name to make sure that your privacy is protected. Before we go to today's event, let me just say what else is coming up after flying cars and innovation in Japan. We will, in 2 weeks from now, have Sone-san, and Mr. Sone is the Consul General of Japan in Los Angeles. It's a altogether very interesting fellow who spent many years in India and at the embassy and another number of other places, and he's particularly interested in the free and open Indo-Pacific. So join us for that in 2 weeks from now. And with that, I'm going to actually stop my shares. And here's Asa Quesenberry. Hey, Asa, good morning into Osaka.
Good morning, Ulrike. Thank you again for having me on.
Sure.
Everyone...
Wait. I have to introduce you first. Because the live people, of course, have read your bio, but the recorded people don't. So let me just briefly tell everybody who you are. So Asa Quesenberry joins us from Osaka. He's originally from the United States and earned a BA in, this is very interesting, multiple degree architecture and sustainability at Arizona State University. So we've always been into cities, I guess, yes. And smart. And he's an FAA certified drone operator, unmanned things flying around thing, and then worked in Vancouver for a while as an unmanned aviator, I guess, drone flyer. In 2019, he started his own company, Skyscape, and you see it in the back of us. He's a founder and president of Skyscape, which is a vertiport management company. And so when I first heard that word, I've heard of airports and heliports. I'd never heard of vertiports before. So if we don't learn anything else today, we've learned a new word. So that's always great. And then in 2023, which is actually this year, he became a co-founder of the Startup Guild Japan in Osaka. So what we want to do today, Asa, is we want to learn about Skyscape and the vertiports and flying cars and drones and that sort of thing. But then we're also interested, of course, in learning about your experience of being a startup guy in Japan, because it's often said that Japan's innovation ecosystem is broken and there are no startups, or Japan is not innovative. And so we have a lot of grounds to cover. So thank you, Asa, for joining me this morning. It's great to have you.
Fantastic introduction. Thank you again, Ulrike. Happy to be here. And yeah, spot on. I think everything is checked out on the bio. So happy to jump into it today. And I think we have a lot to talk about.
Good. Yeah. So flying cars. So I teach flying cars in my class. And every time I say flying car, people think I'm a little nuts because, that's far in the future. And Toyota-san from Toyota says in 2030, he might be a mobility as a service company that will take us places in a flying car. So, so can you tell us a little bit about the flying car setting and what that actually is and how far we are? So, and maybe I think you brought some pictures for us that would.
I got a little presentation. We can jump through. It takes a minute or so to run through that. I think we'll just kind of set the context for the discussions we'll have today. But just to pre-emphasize before we get started, the term flying car is actually the farthest thing from reality. I think it's just the easiest thing for people to relate to when they hear it. They get some mental image of something similar. But what we're essentially talking about is within the last 10 to 15 years, there's been tremendous advancements in aviation. A lot of the technology that you find in drone systems, or UAVs as they're called in the industry, have essentially been integrated into the design of helicopters and traditional fixed wing aircraft. So what this has allowed us to do is we've been able to design a lot of different approaches to aircraft that weren't available, sometime prior. The biggest difference is a lot of the safety is a lot of improvements on safety side of things. They're all clean energy. A lot of these are electric powered systems, and they're much quieter, which is a huge thing. When people think about flying cars, they get images of Blade Runner and they start thinking about helicopter noise. But it's quite different. The reality is, a lot of these aircraft are no louder than a car passing on a street, or that's the goal, I guess, with some improved safety and hopefully a little bit better access for a lot of the general public. So what I'll do real quick is just to, into purpose, these are called eVTOLs, or electric vertical takeoff and landing. So eVTOL. So you'll hear a variety of words. You'll hear air taxi or flying car or eVTOL, all of which work, but it's just good to kind of get a little bit of understanding. So let me very quickly, I will jump into a simple presentation that we can just run through really fast. And I think, again, this kind of sets the background. So give me one moment. Let's see if we just scroll through it. So again, guys, thank you very much. I'm Asa Quesenberry, the president founder here at Skyscape株式会社. We're based, headquartered, founded in Osaka, Japan. We're the only vertiport development startup in this part of the world and in this country. So I like to really start with this question, which is, of all the countries in the world, which country do you think has purchased more than 300 flying cars already, has created national air mobility think tanks, overhauled its national drone laws, given out more than $1 million in grants, and is a major global investor, not just in its own country, but a global investor in this space? And as we're all here on the Japan Zoominar, I think the answer is rather interesting. It's Japan. And this surprises a lot of people, exactly, or because, as you had mentioned, there's lots of kind of, stereotypes. Japan's ecosystems or innovation ecosystems broken, things don't move fast enough here. But within this space, especially within the advanced air mobility space, Japan is a leading country in this area. So I said advanced air mobility, or AAM. What is advanced air mobility? And essentially, it's an aspect of the aviation industry that utilizes a lot of upcoming technology to improve how we move things within our urban and regional systems. So this can be drones, it can be air taxis, it can be autonomous drone systems for farming, agriculture, emergency. There's a lot of different stuff. And with this kind of advances, you have impacts across a full litany of different sectors, everything from logistics to maritime to infrastructure to real estate, agriculture, et cetera, et cetera. So why I get excited about this is my background to aviation is a little bit different, where I was involved originally in architecture and urban planning. I think my passion is city design and urban planning and creating better urban environments for our citizens to live in. And I'm a very firm believer that by leveraging technology within our urban spaces, that's when you can really create the most impact for society as a whole. So when you start thinking of the development and advancement of these eVTOLs and how that impacts just life, but even just the design of cities, suddenly you're moving in 3 dimensions within an urban space, which has cascading effects that I'm sure we've just begun to touch on. Now, within Japan, and why it works so good in Japan is we have a lot of problems here, like every country. But for the big ones, population and workforce, natural disaster mitigation, rural revitalization, economic competitiveness, these are some of the main use cases that advanced air mobility creates value and it creates benefit in. So accessing location, improved logistics, emergency response, efficiency, carbon neutrality, there's a long list we can go into. And in my opinion, I think the Japanese government has acknowledged this. In 2020, I think it was during the Dubai World Expo, Japan, having won the 2025 World Expo, had announced that 2025, we're going to have an operable air taxi system. So the government has acknowledged that this has a lot of value for the country and has really gotten behind the support to overhaul very, very quickly the rules and regulations to allow for this type of industry to take off, no pun intended. That being said, though, there's still lots of challenges within this space. When you're building new industries, these do not happen overnight. The main ones, in my opinion, are the public trust, energy, and infrastructure side of things. Energy is a whole separate beast. I think we would need a whole Zoominar for just the energy side of things. But my focus very much is infrastructure. So this combines my background in urban planning and design with my professional experience in the aviation sector. And these infrastructure points are known as vertiports, right? So vertical ports, there's a heliport, there's an airport, there's a vertiport now. Ironically, the term vertiport is actually not new. Vertiport and air mobility has actually been around since the 60s, when you had a lot of tilt rotor helicopter craft that were coming out. But really what had come down to the time was the technology was rather limited. They were very, very noisy. It was very, very expensive to create. So the actual term vertiport isn't that new. It's just not really in the public space. And then just to finish off, I'll just give some images. We talk about infrastructure. I was at a conference, I think, a couple months ago in Istanbul. We were talking about the industry, and they said there's more than 710 patented new aircraft designs at current. So it's more than 710. And of course, of that, you might see 10 to 15, if that, winners. But there's tons of companies, everything from the small garage-bound inventor all the way up to massive players like Toyota, Rolls-Royce, Airbus. There's a full range of groups that are interested with a variety of aircraft. So these are just some of the ones that are coming out that I think have gained a lot of traction recently. And then on the infrastructure side of things, there's tons of different concepts. There's tons of different approaches to how these facilities will make sense. Are they just built for passenger aircraft? Are they integrated for logistics systems and deliveries? There's a wide range in how all of these can play out. So I'll stop there. I just wanted to give a little bit of background in what's happening in this space. How did we get here? And then really show some people that, the air taxis, they're on their way. There's lots of designs already out there.
So is the vision that at some point I will have, the roof of my house could be a vertiport?
Essentially, you can imagine that there's a couple different ways this will play out. In my personal opinion, this will start very much from the public transit side of things, right? These won't be personally owned in the beginning. You'll have points within an urban environment that, just like an Uber, you can book one of these rides in advance, show up, maybe you spend 15 to 20 minutes in some type of nice lounge environment, and then you get onto your aircraft and you move through the city. So a local example I'll give is that in Osaka, to go from downtown Umeda to the airport, Kansai International Airport, is about an hour and a half trip, can be a little bit longer. But ironically, it's actually quite close. It's just out in the middle of the bay. Now, with one of these eVTOLs, you're looking at an 11-minute straight flight to the airport, right? So drastically reducing that time. But what I like to key in on these days is, in the beginning of this industry, the idea was, we're gonna alleviate urban congestion. We're gonna fix traffic issues, and I can't push that idea at all. I think that, especially here in Japan, it falls on deaf ears. When you come to a country with the most advanced train networks in the world and tell them that we're going to solve urban congestion, it just doesn't miss the mark. So what I instead focus on is optionality, is you're giving optionality to the commuter in their environment that they can choose whichever suits them best for that moment. In reality, we're not going to need eVTOLs in the beginning for everyday commute. But if you've got your son's baseball game on the other side of town, or you're running late and you have to be at a meeting in time, or you had some issue and you can't miss this flight, it's about having optionality to where now you can get to your destination in a variety of approaches. And that's how air mobility, in my opinion, will fit into the current public transit ecosystem that we have, and mobility ecosystem here in the country.
So this probably gets into more what you actually do, which we haven't really heard of. So I want to hear a little bit more about Skyscape. And wouldn't the traffic jam then just be shifting from the road to the air? And so if everybody is in an eVTOL or a flying car, whatever that stuff is, then we have crashes in the air. It's crowded. We may have to wait. We're hovering. We can't land. Right. So isn't this just moving the congestion issue into another level, or is the idea that at that point in time, when this becomes a reality, we won't actually own cars anymore, and there will be so many fewer cars that there will be fewer traffic jams altogether? Or how does what's the vision there?
Vision. Okay, so I'll answer this in two parts. First, I'll answer that, and then I'll give a little bit more background into what Skyscape does. The short answer is no. You're not going to have congestion in the sky. It's not a reality at all. There is no hovering and waiting with these aircraft. You have, because everything is battery based. You have a set time that you have to travel. There is no we're going to sit here and wait and we're going to taxi in the sky. That doesn't happen. But much similar to, commuter train lines that have the route they have, they're scheduled to depart at a certain time. There's nothing blocking them in that path. That will essentially be very, very similar to the eVTOL routes. This is all possible by a lot of advances in the air traffic control systems. It's created this new kind of subset known as UTM, which is unmanned traffic management. And this is essentially utilizing GPS, location services, AI to automate the route scheduling and the actual flight paths these aircraft will take. There's a lot of different discussions, and UTM definitely isn't my specialty, so I won't go too deep into that. But there's talks of regulating it by or altitude. So for example, at this altitude, you're going to be going north and east, or north and south. And then at this altitude, you're going to be going west and east only, right? So it's kind of regulated to skyways, as they're referred to, right? So with UTM, you have a lot of possibilities that will prevent a lot of that congestion, because again, it's not an option for this industry. You might be chosen to move to a different landing points that you can charge faster, but there will be no congestion in the sky. I can't imagine, unless we make some tremendous advances in energy systems and we have the ability to just kind of hover there. I can't see that in the short term. Now, Skyscape. So what does Skyscape do? So as I had mentioned, there's 710 plus different types of aircraft that are patented at current. But with that, there's no infrastructure. It doesn't matter how many aircraft we have if they don't have a place to land, right? So in the same sense that helicopters need helipads or heliports, these aircraft will need vertiports as well. So Skyscape is what's called a vertiport development and management company. And in the early days, we do a lot of work focusing very much on consulting, helping airports, helping regional planners, helping cities develop and plan out how these systems will work for their specific location. Aside from that, we offer really a full kind of cycle of services, to everything to helping people choose a location for their facility, develop the actual facility itself. We sell essentially three main products, helping clients build out these facilities. They're basically block systems that you can put together that kind of stack up to create, really, really interesting and unique applications for their vertiports. So we help them find the location, we consult on that, we help them develop that location, and then long-term speaking, we help them operate that facility and then expand it should they need to. And why this is important is because people say, oh, well, it's a helipad, you just need a flat place to land. And in a sense, that's kind of true, but I actually liken it very, very much to bus networks, right? So when you look at bus networks, you have your bus terminal, and at that bus terminal, you've got servicing of the vehicles, you've got staff changes, you've got maintenance, you've got scheduling, you've got all these different things there, you've got refueling, and then surrounding a radius of that bus terminal, you've got a lot of pickup and drop-off points. So vertiports are actually quite similar to that sense, where within an ecosystem, within a network of location, there's a variety of different services that are required for these aircraft to actually function at scale. We can just talk about charging, for example. Where do I charge? Where do I land and charge? Where do we pick up and drop people off? Where are the operators stationed at? And then a big one we were joking about recently is, where do you store the aircraft? A lot of these aircraft in the short term, as they come out, they're not going to be approved to fly at night. So where do all the air taxis go during the evening, right? So all of these functions and services that are required for the network and ecosystem of actual, aircraft travel, they need to have the infrastructure built in for that. The city needs the infrastructure built for those. And that's essentially what our company focuses on primarily, is helping clients understand what is the best place for X type of service to support that larger network or ecosystem of aircraft travel.
Very cool. Very cool. And so will you also, I can see the charging stations, the parking places. So basically, it's a sort of a mix between an airport, a management, a bus management, and then also, of course, my usage management. So there might be at the user end, there might be an app that allows me to see where I can catch a
reservation.
Am I catching a flight or a ride, or what am I catching? A drone? I'm catching
a road. You're taking a quick jump through the city, right? There's a lot of things, but it's also with the infrastructure, and this is really, you know, we've raised venture capital, and I think one of the things that separates us from, you know, the 4 or 5 other companies in the world that are focused on this is we don't limit what our focus is to just the eVTOLs, just the aircraft. Really, you know, and I champion this idea that air mobility is much bigger than just an air taxi taking you from point A to point B. You know, when you look at integrating the advances in drone systems, I mean, you're talking about emergency response, you're talking about logistics systems, you're talking about infrastructure assessment, security, risk management. You know, there's a lot of things that the drones and the aircraft in general can do. So what we're looking to build out is, of course, the infrastructure to support the passenger operations, but then also within this infrastructure at these locations, you have embedded systems that the community is able to access, right? So an image I'll give you is we were just in India with the civil aviation ministry down there, and we're talking about India has a huge need for emergency response. They've got this concept of the golden hour where there's lots of people in India, as we all know. And if you're on a highway in India and you get in a car accident and you're injured in some way, the likelihood of you surviving that accident after the first hour drastically falls off. If you don't get response within that first hour, you know, there's a very high chance of a fatality. So with India's focus, you know, they want to have this emergency response. So the idea being that at one of these vertiport facilities, yes, a passenger can arrive and book a flight and they can move from point A to point B in the city. But let's say there's an accident nearby. The local emergency services would correspond with the actual vertiport to deploy a drone system, a medical package, whatever it might be, from that infrastructure point to the accident location to have faster response times to that patient or to that person that was in that crash. So it's much bigger than that. It's much bigger than just passengers. You know, it's really about how can we utilize aviation more in our urban environments to actually make improvements for good, not just allowing the affluent business guy to travel through the city faster than other people. I think my biggest fear for this industry is it just becomes a plaything for the rich. And that's kind of fueled all of our focus and developments here at Skyscape, is we want to make sure that that's one aspect of the whole system, but it's just one piece of the pie. You know, there's so many other things that can be utilized to really create value for these communities that they're set up in.
Yeah, very cool. I mean, I probably will start with the rich people as a toy, but if the utility is there, then the cities, I guess, could invest in it. So the questions are coming in, and there's actually several that I was going to ask myself, but the audience can do it much better than I can. So I'll just read out their questions. So Tetsuji and Amy have a similar question, which is, you started us out with a quiz, and of course I kind of knew the answer. Yes, Japan. But the question is, what was the point to getting to the leading position in the air mobility industry from Japan? Did the government start this? I think it's Toyota.
This is a great question.
In collaboration with universities, small factories in Higashi Osaka, you know, and I guess second question is, can we copy that? I mean, if it's so successful, can we copy that elsewhere?
So this is really one of my favorite questions, and it's really exciting because it dispels a lot of the myth about Japan's startup innovation. I think Japan is as you know, I'm sure very well, right? Japan is a very unique business ecosystem and culture and working here. And startups are very, very new, right? Startups have kind of been imposed on the country. They're not naturally from here. And it's about, you know, maybe a little bit slower than people would like, but it's about figuring out how do startups work in the Japanese sense. So to answer the question, how did Japan get here? How did Japan become a leader? I think first and foremost, it's about unification of an idea and an approach. I mean, there is no outlying group that's not on board with this. I mean, you have everything from the government to the corporates, to the small businesses, to the startups, to the university. There is a huge unified focus on air mobility. I think a big catalyst of that is the Osaka World Expo. Maybe the government, for better or worse, the government said in 2020, we're going to have air taxis. And at the time, they didn't even have like a commercial drone license system, which is very, 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 that's the baby steps before you have, air taxis flying above head. So first and foremost, it's this kind of unified idea. I think that really galvanized people, and it got people excited, and it got everyone from, like I said, the corporates are waiting for indication from the government, the regulators as well, to, is this something that's real? So with everyone on the same page, that's allowed for a lot of, focused movement. And one unique aspect that I think makes Japan's situation actually rather difficult to copy is the involvement of what's, these shosha, these conglomerate level companies. And this is a big key. And this is, I've talked about this, and I've given presentation on the financing side of this industry. And I think this is Japan's secret sauce, essentially, within this industry. So when you look at startups, right, it's venture capital. You've got an idea, you're not going to be profitable for some time. You raise capital to get you to that profitable point, and then you're good to go. But the challenge with building new industries, especially industries where you're building planes, and just a spoiler alert, building a plane is really expensive, especially a brand new plane that doesn't use a combustion engine. It's very, 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 very expensive, like billions of dollars just to get one aircraft certified through the safety processes necessary before they're available. So typical venture capital just can't handle this. If you're a venture capitalist and you're looking at a 2, 3, or 4 year return on investment in an air mobility startup, it's not going to happen. Right, the timelines are so much longer than what is kind of common within a typical venture capital venture that they choose to invest in. Right, so in come the shoshas, and the shoshas, for people that aren't familiar, these are your conglomerate level Japanese businesses like Mitsubishi, Sumitomo, that are. They're trading houses, but they're also a little bit of everything. I mean, they're really, in many ways, they have massive economic generation within them. And a lot of them are looking to innovate. And now, if you're a shosha, you don't need a 3-year ROI, right? Your time scales are so much longer, where for you, you're planning on how can we be competitive 30 years in the future, right? Their time scales are so much different. So this has allowed Japan to move so much faster than other countries because the shosha get involved and they put in huge amounts of money. I mean, like upwards of $400-500 million, billion-dollar investments in these aircraft manufacturers and the infrastructure side of things, with the premise that they have the human capital to really help, these companies move along, help them make inroads here in Japan, but without that pressure on the aircraft manufacturers you have to produce a product in 3 years, which the reality is just it's not real. So the shosha have a huge involvement in moving this forward. And it's allowed Japan to, although they had a very, very slow start compared to the UK and the US, Japan has rapidly become, a leader in this space, I think a lot in part due to the involvement of these shosha.
Interesting. So on this topic, Amy invites us to dig a little deeper. She wonders why you think that Japan specifically. So where did this Expo idea come from, right? So there, they said, okay, so Expo, we have flying taxis, but how did they come up with this? And is there anything specifically Japanese about this? So crowded environments, energy efficiency, is it island nation, is it Monozukuri, and we're leaders of cars and all
the above. No, I think, and a lot of people all the time, they're like, I came to Japan 4 years ago, spoke very little Japanese, fell in love with the country and wanted to, create something that, could kind of contribute. And this was my specialty. But people ask me all the time, why did you start an air mobility startup here in Japan? And it wasn't necessarily in Japan, but as we had the startup and we kept going, we realized that the use cases in Japan apply so much stronger than other countries. So when you look at the aircraft, for example, the range on these aircraft are 15 to at most 60, 70 kilometers, right? With the current battery limitations that we have. So naturally, these aren't going to replace your Shinkansen. They're not going to replace an airplane, right? We might move to electrified aircraft, but it's not going to replace. An air taxi will never have a better economic output than an actual aircraft, right? If I'm going to Osaka to Tokyo, for the next 35 years, 40 years, unless there's some crazy development, a plane or a Shinkansen will be the best bet. However, Japan is an island nation of 80% mountains, right? So naturally, access to locations is a little bit difficult. On top of that, the location and topography is so close together that the daily commuter goes, like in the Kansai region here, we have Osaka, Kyoto, Kobe, Nara, these 4 cities in very, very close proximity. If you're a business person in Osaka, it's not uncommon at all for you to go to Kyoto in the morning, come back to Osaka, have a meeting in Kobe in the afternoon. The daily commuter moves all throughout these urban environments naturally already, right? So in terms of why it makes sense in Japan is if I'm in the US, I'm from the East Coast US, I'm from the Philadelphia area. I'm not going from Philadelphia to Boston. I'm not going from Boston to New York. I might have within my urban environment lots of travel, but naturally the trips in the US or larger countries like the US are New York to Miami, Miami to Dallas, Dallas to Los Angeles. So naturally, the aircraft don't fit into that environment. They fit much more into the Japanese, just the how the outlay of the lands are here and how the commuter mindset works. So the use cases just on the passenger side make a lot more sense. But a lot of those challenges I mentioned before, I think are really evident for the government. And when you really get into the technical capabilities and how the aircraft and the drones can make an impact, all of the big challenges we have here in Japan, aging workforce, access location, disaster response, this is the shining use cases for the technology within advanced air mobility. And I just think that the government had, quite a bit of insight into that and made the call that, hey, we're not going to sit by and watch this develop around us. We're going to have an active participation in that. Mixed in with the fact that maybe because you have massive automobile companies that are now switching from this mindset of I'm an automotive manufacturer to a mobility provider, right? That's Toyota's whole thing now. It's not about creating cars, it's about creating mobility. And that could be everything from a kickboard scooter to a motorcycle all the way up to an air taxi, right? So a lot of different factors have come together, with the catalyst point being this Osaka World Expo. And if you aren't familiar with the World Expos, they're basically every 5 years, it's a global showcase of technological development, right? So we've got the next one. They're building a big island in the middle of the bay here in Osaka, and that's where they want to debut a lot of these aircraft at.
So there are a number of questions that all go at the opposite question. What are aren't there a lot of things in Japan that would actually be against this? Like, snow in Hokkaido, typhoons, winds, so we understand, and you didn't mention population density, but from an economic perspective, and a business perspective, the fact that you have so many people going around, this will scale at some point much faster than in the United States, as you mentioned, right? But so how about all of the things that
challenges
difficult? Yeah.
First and foremost, it's energy. Energy is at current the biggest challenge here in Japan. And a lot of this isn't necessarily just Japan. Japan's in a transition period for energy. I have a lot of good friends in the energy space, and with the Fukushima disaster of 3/11, there was a lot of nuclear plants that were shut down. And say what you will about nuclear, but it provides quite a bit of energy for Japan. So at the same time that you had shutting down a lot of nuclear plants, you had the introduction of renewables. Japan's got amazing targets, what they want to do for offshore wind, but the challenge being that it will take time. So we're in that transition period where the goals we want to reach have not yet been reached, which means there's, if you live in Japan, I'm sure you know that the last 2 years have been crazy in terms of our energy prices through the summer or through the winter. So the grid itself, the energy production here in the country, but also, and again, I'm not super versed in the charging space, but there's some actual regulatory limitations on charging systems here in the country. And I think a lot of them were designed to protect the grid from essentially too much strain on the grid. But for example, fast charging systems, EVs for electric vehicles, they're quite hard to install. I think that has, for example, led to a little bit slower market penetration for groups like Tesla, right? Simply because it's very, very challenging with the regulatory space to get these fast charging systems installed to actually support, the vehicles. And this carries over into the eVTOL space, where you need to charge these aircraft somewhere, right? So if you have regulation that prevents fast charging, if I'm an eVTOL operator, these flights are only going to be 8 minutes, right? I do an 8-minute flight, and then I need to charge somewhere. If it takes me 2 hours to charge my aircraft because there's no fast charging, it doesn't scale, it doesn't work. So first and foremost, energy is probably the biggest bottleneck we're all currently looking at. The regulatory space has actually moved much faster than I think anyone even realizes. Again, I had mentioned briefly that in 2020, Japan didn't even have a commercial drone pilot's license. You had lots of little schools that had their license, but there wasn't a national license system. And in a 3 or 4 year span, we've gone from that to what's called level 4 flight permissions. And this is essentially a licensing system that allows for a drone delivery company or an emergency response company to operate these aircraft over extremely densely populated areas. And again, it sounds a little, people are like, oh, I don't know if I like that, but this wasn't, it's not, it's Japan. This wasn't just randomly approved. There's been steps and processes and safety checks, to make sure that this would be okay. So the regulatory space has moved really quick. So energy is a big challenge. And I think, to me, it's probably public trust is one of the biggest limitations, where Japan's a 51% country. And what I mean by that is, until you reach that 51% majority, everything moves very, 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 very slowly. So publicly speaking, there's interest, but there's also a lot of skepticism, obviously, right? If you go into, and I think this is what we, harped on when we founded the company, is that if you go into this small little town and you say, hey, we're going to build this flying carport, and you guys are going to be able to travel to see your family, they're like, my family lives down the street, and they still don't visit. They're not going to visit, once we have an air taxi system. So the infrastructure in the industry, it has to provide more value than just passenger movement, right? And this goes back to, like I said, there's a variety of systems and technology that can be utilized. So to me, it's those are the two things. It's the public trust side of things. It's the public awareness and education, really dispelling a lot of kind of myths that are presented to us from media, Blade Runner. When people say flying car, they get lots of crazy images. But energy and public trust are definitely the two biggest challenges, I think.
So I've heard for many years now that the city of Tokyo is pondering, although I don't know, they've been pondering for a long time. But there's a pondering going on regarding taking cars out of downtown Tokyo altogether. And with downtown, I mean, Chiyoda-ku, so like north of Tokyo, and just have maybe delivery trucks and repair vehicles or something, right? So, but all private traffic go out, and there's a lot of pondering going on, because that's not going to work unless maybe if we have flying cars, then we could do that, right? So
there are a lot of options, I think.
So, so you mentioned the Shosha as an important player, and I think these general trading houses, and I've always thought of them as partially with one leg being like private equity or venture capital players. But let's talk a little bit about, and it's interesting that they're in this space, and it makes a lot of sense for them because they're also logistics providers, right? So this is just straight down their alley. I was going to ask you a little bit more about the startup innovation ecosystem. So, and we do have questions from the audience about venture capital and how is this going to go. And you mentioned regulation. So can we, step back a little bit from the flying cars and more generally, maybe go to your startup guild, Japan and Osaka interest. So what's the situation with startups? We hear so many bad things about this, and yet I meet so many interesting innovators in this country. So it's very confusing. So
startups in Japan. Yes, this has become my world for the last 5 years, essentially. Startups are as foreign to Japan as one can imagine. Everything about a startup is not Japan in a sense. The idea of rapid turnover in staff, messing up your designs, failing fast, as Silicon Valley says. This goes against everything that is modern Japanese business. But the reality being that, as we all know, Japan needs innovation. We need to innovate. We need to move forward in a lot of ways. But in many sense, startups have kind of been forced on the country in a sense, whether it's
the Silicon Valley type startups have been.
Yes, exactly. So
the other startups.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. The Silicon Valley fail fast, break things type mentality, are kind of being pushed on the country. And I think, as with many things in Japan, it's about finding the balance of how do we bring in this good thing into the country, but how do we make it work in the Japan fabric of business and social environment. So the Startup Guild, we created, myself and a buddy of mine, Dwayne Grech, who's another founder based here in Osaka. And what we realized within the startup ecosystem here in Japan is there's lots of good intentions, but they totally miss the mark in terms of their execution. A lot of that is because there isn't representation of people in startups. You've got government groups that have, people in government and people in private companies that have worked 30 years in a government or corporate environment who are now trying to craft regulation and support for startups. So it's great that the intention's there, but again, there's no direct experience. And I'll give you a really good example of this is, I think it was the start of last year, Prime Minister Kishida, when he had just come into office, he had this ambitious goal where Japan will send 1,000 startups to Silicon Valley to learn in Silicon Valley and come back to Japan and bring that innovation back with them. So it was 200 a year for 5 years was the goal. And our startup, Skyscape, we were one of the first companies, one of the first startups in this first batch. So we got sent to the UC Berkeley for the Skydeck Accelerator in partnership with JETRO, which is a huge trade organization, with the idea being go there for 2 months, learn lots of things, learn how to enter the American market, and come back to Japan with that innovation, which is fantastic. But I don't know if anyone's looked at a flight to, San Francisco recently from Japan. It's quite expensive. I don't know if you've looked at UC Berkeley hotels on campus. Very expensive for 3 days, let alone 2 months stay in the country, right? So there was no support for the startups to then go do this. You had to finance it all yourself. And if you're a founder and you're penny pinching off your last pre-seed investment round, spending $20,000 for you and a staff to be in San Francisco for, 5 weeks to learn is rather unrealistic. And this was a huge response from a lot of the members of that group is they wanted to be there. They wanted to have more of their teams in that space because it was a fantastic learning environment, but they just didn't have that support to make it reality. So this goes back to the idea of really good intentions, kind of missing the mark with execution. And this is what we're trying to alleviate with the Startup Guild. Is we wanted to create a group that was for startups by startups. So all the members of the founders are all startup founders themselves. We have experience in Japanese, ventures and Japanese startups here. And we wanted to create a collective body that could better inform startups on how to proceed in the unique Japanese startup environment, how to get advice on venture capital, how to open a bank account, how to get visas for your staff, a lot of these huge hurdles to getting startups up and running. And then on the other hand, provide a collective representative body that can work directly with regulators and advisors from the corporate or government side to come up with better execution on, okay, here's our intention. And then here's with the reality of a startup, here's how we actually execute that. And here's what's needed for the startup ecosystem. And then also creating, something here in Osaka. There's obviously tons of value, Shibuya startup out in Tokyo, for example. But Osaka's second biggest city. I think there's some 23 million people in the greater Osaka area. But you don't get a lot of that same support. So we wanted to be involved. We wanted to create a group that saying, hey, Osaka has just as many, Kansai region has a lot of stuff going on here. And we want to be able to provide support for the founders in this area. And then for, like we said, the collective organizers, government advisors to push the industry forward in a way that makes sense.
So there's an interesting policy disconnect in the story that you just told, where so on the one hand, I think we all agree that this dog-eat-dog, slash and burn, Silicon Valley style of entrepreneurship is just not the right pace for here. When people, then we could have a very long conversation around that. Right? And, selling your company after 2 years, grandma might think that's a failure, and, or your mother-in-law might think that's a failure. That would be even worse. And so that sort of thing, right? So the societal thinking around what constitutes success, what's a great story, and so forth, that Japan just has to find its own way on that, because the Silicon Valley model is probably not going to be the thing. And yet, at the same time, there are all these government programs that somehow Japan should go to Silicon Valley to learn. And for me, it doesn't make sense to send the startups to Silicon Valley. Maybe we should send grandma to Silicon Valley, right? So, or so that people, that the larger society changes. But I don't think that's even less feasible, obviously. So wouldn't be a better policy route to say, well, okay, so we're in Japan. This is what it is. So what is the definition of a successful startup in this country? And therefore, what do venture capitalists need to do in this place? And how do we need to get deep tech started? And you mentioned deep tech as opposed to an app that kind of flies in like 2 years. Deep tech takes 10, 20 years, right? And so what you're doing is deep tech. And so you need several $1 million, hundreds of millions of dollars probably before you're done. Right. And that's not gonna happen in a venture capital setting, maybe. So why are we trying to go to Silicon Valley and learn if that's not even a good model?
I think it's about, again, is you have to start somewhere. And you can, and Silicon Valley is the place. Silicon Valley has 30 plus years of startup experience, startup history in that area. As we've seen recently with everything from the FTX collapse to the Silicon Valley Bank, we're starting to realize that, there's some holes in that system. That's not a perfect system by any means, but you have to start somewhere. And I think, again, a lot of it is just education, understanding. I think there's lots of myths that need to be dispelled, and I can give from the social acceptance point of view. I think one of the biggest challenges is you need talent in startups, essentially, right? But the Japanese labor markets are not a place where people are constantly moving around to different jobs, right? So talent is very, very restricted. And at the same time, it's very difficult for people to come here and be based here. So you have this kind of friction and non-movement of talent that needs to kind of be opened up. But also from the social acceptance side, we have a staff. She joined our company when she was 23 or something, quite young. And for the first 6 months, there was this huge stress on her because her family didn't approve of her decision. What is a start? You're working for a flying car start. What is that? That doesn't even sound real. You need to be working at a corporation, something that's safe, so to speak, right? So thankfully, we've won some awards. We've been in the news a little bit. I think her mom is a little bit more approving of the company at now, but it was a huge stress on her because she didn't have that family support behind her, saying, okay, we approve of you working here. And when you're 23, obviously you're still quite, involved with your family. That was a huge aspect for her. But on the flip side, when you look at, for example, we talk about women in the workplace in Japan. The number one industry of women in management and executive positions in Japan is startups, right?
That's right. Because there they can't, because it's flat, right?
Exactly. It's flat. There's opportunity. So, she jokes all the time. And in the first year she was with us, she's learned more about business and in so many different aspects outside of her, what her role was supposed to be in the company. That's been such a good development for her. So you have the social side of things, they're very against it without, realizing all of the value and the potential opportunities that can come from more engagement with startups. But again, these things take time, right? I think when you have more people in startups, successful startups, that are creating value, that just starts to cascade. It's, as with many things in Japan is just slow, right? So it'll take time, but once you get to that 51%, more and more, I see it changing. I've been involved in a lot of coaching programs to help young startups here in Japan, and it's changing slowly. But for the older generations, for the families, for the grandparents, they're still slow to see it because it's the total opposite. Like we said, startups are the opposite of everything that is Japan business culture. But just because it's opposite, just improbable doesn't mean impossible, right? It just takes a little bit of time for it to get moving.
And I think it is changing in the sense that there are now more Todai, advanced Todai graduates interested in joining a startup than joining Kazumi Ngaseki.
And there's like the government realizes this too. For example, I think they pushed this, there's a TV show called like Unicorn or something, and it was about a young female founder, and it became this, really, really popular TV show. So it's just about being more present in the social fabric of Japan. And I think in terms of your question, was, well, what's a successful startup? This is a huge barrier here in Japan as well, because they don't have the metrics to understand that. So I worked briefly with the American Chamber of Commerce in Japan. This young, it was a task force to create a list of recommendations to the government to improve the startup ecosystem. And one of the biggest things on the list was you need a different barometer for startup success. Like bank accounts are a great example. To get a bank account as a startup is an absolute nightmare. To get a credit card is an absolute nightmare, because what they're comparing you to is that of a corporate, to get a corporate startup, right? If you're looking at visa renewals, to renew your visa for startups, they go through and evaluate your company. Well, how do they evaluate? They look at revenue generation, they look at employee retainment. They're holding you to the same standards of a massive corporation. So that was one of the biggest things on our list that we had recommended was, a different kind of playbook on how to evaluate a startup, its progress, its traction. So I think that's the framework, and that's kind of the discussion, and that's kind of the information we need to give to the regulatory side, the government side, that, for example, the Startup Guild is kind of working on putting together, so that there is just better metrics and better understanding of, okay, startups and normal businesses are totally different. It's comparing oranges to apples. We have to look at a different way to evaluate them that makes sense.
So the startups are not the only players that are getting a bad rap, right? So the venture capitalists are also said to be not so great or bada. So they're the banker mindset, and they put $10,000 here and there. Is that fair? Is that changing as well? Is that, what's the scene there?
We have pretty fantastic investors. I think they're really hands-on. I think they do much more than some Western venture capitals in terms of support for the startup, support more in the sense of education. Like they do a lot of work with me, like helping me understand the different aspects of Japanese business culture. And you might want to do it this way, but here's how the reality is. Let's find the balance. But to my knowledge, I think a lot of it is just experience. I think, again, startups are so new, right? So I can't speak for every venture capital group. I think one of the common ideas or discussions is that the investors here make very, very poor investments. And if you can come to them with any idea, and if you can make it seem like you're the expert, you can get funding. And then they point to, example, for SoftBank. SoftBank's last three advancements have been a huge waste of investment. So maybe some inexperience, but it's changing. Where this isn't, although startups are new, we are getting years of experience now. We are seeing successes. We are seeing failures. With the investments here, one of the biggest challenges on the venture capital side is, they want your business to be successful in Japan, but they want your business to be successful globally. And I think that's where a lot of the startups are struggling here in Japan, is building your product for the Japanese market is so unique that when you get into another, country, essentially, you kind of fall flat because it's just not up to par of what's needed in that country. So the venture capital side, they want you to do both. They want you to be able to win here and win abroad as well, and finding that balance. And then from the investors, their struggles, it's experience, it's understanding. I think for me and my investors, the relationship has been lots of learning, where I'm not Japanese. I live in Japan. I love this country. I understand the fabric here, at least to the best of my extent, but that doesn't mean I'm going to approach things in a Japanese way. Sometimes I want to move fast, right? Sometimes we need to make, movements and decisions. So I think that's been a big learning experience for them, is understanding that my approach and my views might not be the same as theirs. It doesn't mean they're wrong. It's just about, figuring out what the balance is. So all the standard stuff in Japan, cultural exchange, understanding that there's a balance, is very, very present in the venture capital space.
So allow me just to footnote that obviously every company was once a startup. So to say that there is no startup. I mean, of course, you're right, recently, but Honda was a startup at some point, right? Toyota was a startup at some point. Yeah. And so just to, to give a little bit more nuance to that story is that I guess what happens was with fast economic growth in the 70s and 60s and 70s, it was harder for startups to launch because the government was so focused on helping the large companies get even bigger, right? And so that created that thing. So I don't see why we cannot go back to the days when Honda-san decided to put an engine on a bicycle, right? So that can happen, and I think it is happening. I think there are a lot of indications that this is happening. Do you think that the government, which of course has like tons of programs, is that other than the one that you just mentioned, where it was actually a great program, but it was unfunded, but there are lots of government funds available. Is that a good thing, or is that crowding out the market? And I'm asking that whether that's a model for other countries.
It's a good thing, but again, it's the execution. So what we've found with a lot of these grants and these government programs is you need GSIC, you need your portfolio, you need some type of validation of what you do. And I think this is one of the big challenges is like, if you're a corporate company and you look at a startup, these corporate companies have been around for 100+ years. So even if you're a startup and you're like, oh, we survived 5 years as a startup, to a corporate, you're an infant, you're like the smallest type of business, right? And the government views you the same. So when you're applying for these programs, there's a hesitancy to give the funding to a startup because you don't have what's considered, an appropriate track record in Japan. So you often have to find a larger group to jointly apply for these programs together to actually receive the grant money or the funding that is being offered. So it's good of course it's good. Anytime the government is helping, support and helping funding, that's obviously a good thing. I think the development needs to happen is it needs to be a bit more accessible. It needs to be accessible to startups without them having to go ponder to a larger group to make sure that it gets in. Because what happens, and I think I can't speak for every large conglomerate, but there's a huge brain drain problem right now where you'll get an investment from a big corporate and then they'll gut the innovation, right? They'll play it safe within. So then you lose that put a motor on the back of a bike type mentality, right? It becomes a little bit too safe. So access to these programs would benefit quite a bit. And I think things are changing that direction, but again, it takes time.
Well, time is the ultimate. We have 2 minutes, and we have a question from Patman. So I think there's a great last question. So, why did you select Japan for your startup? And I think it was maybe a little bit implicit because that's where the action is. But you could go many places with this. Why?
Well, I didn't come here for a startup. I came here. My family will never let me forget. I came here for 6 months. I had a 6-month trip booked to Japan, and then I never left. And that was 4.5 years ago. So they're always you're like, oh, that 6-month trip, quite long. No, for me, it was I came to this country just by chance, just wanting to spend a little bit of time here, and then realized that one, I love being here. I think Osaka, Kansai region is a fantastic place to be based at. I fell in love with this kind of part of the country and realized that one, if I was going to be here, I wanted to contribute more. I didn't want to just take the standard, I'm going to teach or I'm going to work in, some corporation, I wanted to do more. I come from a bit of an entrepreneurial background. So I always kind of had that mindset. And then just through discovery on my own, I realized that my own personal career in the aviation drone space with my academic background in architecture, there was a huge need for that here in Japan at the time. So I didn't come here for startups, but startups became why I stayed here long term, so to speak. Had I had known that we would start the startup and then 2 weeks later the country would be shut down for COVID, maybe I would have thought of things a little bit differently. But we just passed the 3-year mark, so things are rolling. It's very, very exciting. And again, thank you, Ulrike, for having me on. It's been an absolute pleasure. I hope we can chat again.
It's been a fabulous conversation. Thank you. And we wish you good luck. And please go fast, because I do want to see this in my lifetime. So I hope that
World Expo. Yes. Come visit Osaka. And for anyone in the audience that has more questions, please connect with me on LinkedIn. I've got a QR code here you guys can check out. I'm happy to chat with you more if you guys want to learn a little bit more. And then we hope to see you all in Osaka shortly.
That's right, for the expo. And in 2 weeks from now, we have Consul General Sonnet from the LA Consul going to talk about the free and open Indo-Pacific. So we'll see you all there. Until then, stay well and happy, and we'll see you then. Goodbye.
Cheers. Thank you, guys.